She rode 3 days across open Texas to hand herself over to a stranger, and he tore the contract in half before she could say a word. If you've ever had someone take away your only plan and leave you standing in the dust with nothing but the clothes on your back and a grief you couldn't name, then you already know how Evelyn Hartwell felt the moment Rhett Callahan looked at her like she wasn't a debt to be collected, but a person worth saving. Stay with me to the end of this story. Hit that like button and drop the name of the city you're watching from in the comments. I want to see just how far this story travels. The horse had started limping somewhere outside of Caldwell, and Evelyn had kept riding anyway. She told herself it was because she didn't have the luxury of stopping. She told herself the mare could rest once they reached the Callahan property, that an extra hour on a tender hoof wouldn't ruin the animal. But the truth she kept pushing down beneath the practical thoughts, was that if she stopped moving, she would have to feel what she was riding toward. And she wasn't ready for that. 3 days on the trail from San Marcos had given her too much time to think and not enough to do about any of it. The land stretched out flat and indifferent around her, broken up by low brush and the occasional stand of live oak. The sky so wide it felt like it was pressing down on her shoulders. Texas in late November had a particular kind of cold to it. Not the brutal, bone-splitting cold she'd heard about up north, but a damp chill that got into the cracks of you, into the places you hadn't bothered to button up because you'd left the house in a hurry back in June and had been making hurried decisions ever since. Her husband had been dead for 4 months. She kept having to remind herself of that, which struck her as strange. A woman ought to know, with certainty, that her husband was dead. But Daniel had always had a way of being absent even when he was present, coming and going on business she never fully understood, sending letters that told her a great deal without saying anything of substance. His death had felt, at first, like one more long absence. It wasn't until the creditors started showing up at the door that the permanence of it settled in. The first man had come 3 weeks after the funeral. Polite enough, hat in hand, standing on the porch of the little house in San Marcos that Evelyn had believed was hers. A loan, he'd said, taken out 18 months prior. Daniel had signed the papers himself. Evelyn had asked how much, and the number had made her sit down on the porch step without meaning to. After that, they'd kept coming. It turned out that Daniel Hartwell had been a man with ambitions considerably larger than his means, and a talent for borrowing against futures that never materialized. The house had a lien on it. The furniture was collateral for a merchant's debt she hadn't known existed. There was a note to a bank in Austin that she couldn't begin to service. And then there was the contract, the one a lawyer named Beaumont had brought her in October, unfolding it on the kitchen table with the air of a man delivering news he found personally distasteful. The contract was with a rancher in Hays County. Name of Callahan. Rhett Callahan, operating out of a property called the Crosshatch. According to the contract, signed, dated, witnessed, Daniel had borrowed $700 from this Callahan 2 years ago, secured against Evelyn's labor. If Daniel died before repayment, the debt transferred to her. She would work it off at the standard rate for a household woman on a frontier property, which the contract specified at $8 a month. At that rate, with the interest that had accumulated, she owed the Callahan ranch the better part of 3 years. Lawyer Beaumont had been careful to explain that the contract was legal. He'd been less careful about keeping the pity out of his voice. Evelyn had sat with it for 3 weeks. She'd written one letter to Callahan and received no reply. She'd considered fighting it and consulted the only other lawyer in San Marcos who told her the contract looked sound, and she'd spend more fighting it than it was worth. She'd considered running in the small, shameful hours of the night, and discarded that too. She had a little money left, not much, barely enough for the journey, and the prospect of spending what remained of her life looking over her shoulder for a man she'd wronged had no appeal. So she'd packed what she could carry, sold what she couldn't, and ridden north toward Hays County to present herself to the man who owned 3 years of her future. Chet. The Crosshatch property was larger than she'd expected. She'd been building a picture of it in her mind during the ride. Something small and mean, the kind of operation run by a man who lent money at interest to strangers and wrote contracts that enslaved widows. She'd imagined a ramshackle collection of buildings, a lean-to barn, a house that looked like an argument between ambition and neglect. What she found instead was a working ranch of some size, set back from the road behind a split-rail fence that ran as far as she could see in both directions. The house was a proper structure, 2 stories, built from limestone block the color of old cream, with a wide porch and a second-floor gallery that would catch the evening breeze in summer. The barn was big and freshly painted. There were cattle visible in the south pasture, a neat row of outbuildings, a vegetable garden that had been put to bed for winter. Someone had worked hard here. Someone had been working hard for a long time. She sat her horse at the gate and looked at it and felt the ground shift slightly under her certainty. She'd spent 3 days rehearsing her arrival as a confrontation. The wronged woman facing down the man who held her by the throat. It was harder to hold that posture facing a place that looked like this. A man came out of the barn before she'd finished looking. He was tall, taller than she'd expected, though she hadn't known she'd had expectations, and lean in the way of men who worked with their bodies rather than ate with them. Dark hair, worn a little long under a battered hat. He walked with the unhurried ease of someone on his own land, and he stopped about 15 feet from the gate and looked at her without speaking. "I'm looking for Rhett Callahan," Evelyn said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "Found him," the man said. She'd prepared a speech. 3 days on the trail, and she'd worked it down to something she felt good about. Direct, businesslike. No pleading in it. She'd introduce herself, acknowledge the contract, offer to begin work as soon as he was ready to receive her. She wouldn't beg and she wouldn't cry, and she wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing how frightened she was. "My name is Evelyn Hartwell," she said. "My husband was Daniel Hartwell, out of San Marcos. He borrowed money from you 2 years ago, and the contract says the debt passes to me. I've come to fulfill it." Callahan looked at her for a long moment. He had a weathered face, the kind that made it difficult to guess his age, somewhere in his 30s probably, though the sun and wind had drawn lines around his eyes that could have belonged to an older man. He wasn't wearing a gun. She'd expected a gun. "Get down off that horse," he said. "She's favoring her left foreleg." Evelyn blinked. "I'm aware of that." "Then get her off it." He turned and walked toward the barn. It wasn't an invitation exactly, but it wasn't a refusal either. Evelyn dismounted. Her legs complained about it, 3 days in the saddle, and led the mare through the gate and toward the barn. By the time she got there, Callahan was already crouched by a water trough, filling it. He stood when she entered and looked at the horse first, which Evelyn noted. "Let me see her foot," he said. He didn't wait for permission. He moved to the mare's left side, ran his hand down the leg with a practiced certainty, and lifted the hoof. The mare let him, which she didn't do for everyone. "Stone bruise," he said. "She needs rest and a poultice. You've been riding her hard." "I needed to get here." "Why?" The question caught her off guard. "Because the contract has a provision. If I didn't present myself within a reasonable period after Daniel's death, the amount owed doubles. I couldn't afford—" She stopped. She'd been about to say she couldn't afford the extra time. "I needed to comply with the terms." Callahan set the horse's foot down and straightened up. He looked at her, and she had the uncomfortable feeling of being read the way people read contracts, carefully, looking for the parts that might be important later. "You got the contract with you?" he said. She reached into her coat and pulled out the folded papers. They were worn along the creases from how many times she'd opened and read them during the past 3 weeks, trying to find something she'd missed. She held them out. He took them. He unfolded them and read them, and she watched his face and saw nothing useful in it. Then he folded them along the original creases and tore them in half. She heard herself make a sound. Not a word, just an intake of breath. He tore them in half again and dropped the pieces on the barn floor. "I don't want your labor," he said. He turned away and went back to tending the horse. Evelyn stood in the door of the barn and looked at the 4 pieces of paper on the floor and tried to understand what had just happened. Her mind kept skidding off the fact of it. The contract was gone. 3 years of servitude, torn up and dropped in the dirt. She waited for relief and found that what came instead was something closer to panic. "I don't understand," she said. "It's straightforward enough. It's legal. You can't just—" "It was a valid contract." "It was my contract," Callahan said, still with his back to her. "Mine to do with as I liked. I didn't want it when Daniel signed it, and I don't want it now." "Then why—" She stopped. "Why did you let him sign it?" He turned around then. His face had a complicated expression on it, something that wasn't quite guilt and wasn't quite grief, but sat somewhere near both of them. "Because he came to me with nothing, and he needed the money, and I told him I didn't want interest, but he kept insisting on security, so I let him write it up the way he wanted. I figured I'd tear it up if it ever came due." He looked at her. It came due. Evelyn had been prepared for this man to be her enemy. She had not been prepared for him to be something else. something more confusing. He owed you $700, she said. He did. That's a significant amount of money. You're just forgiving it. I'm not forgiving anything, Callahan said, with a flatness that wasn't unkind. Daniel's dead. What I'm doing is declining to collect it from someone who didn't borrow it. She looked at him for a long moment. Outside the barn, the light was going gold and long across the pasture. The mare had found the water trough and was drinking. I don't know where to go, Evelyn said. She hadn't meant to say it. It was a private thing, the kind of thing you admitted to yourself in the dark, but not out loud to a stranger. She felt her face heat up and looked at a point past his shoulder. I mean, she said more carefully, I came here with a plan, and the plan was to work off the debt, and now there's no debt. I'll need a moment to think about next steps. Callahan studied her. Where's your people? My parents are dead. I have a sister in Missouri, but there are circumstances. It's not an option. What about Daniel's family? They made their feelings about the marriage clear when it happened. They made their feelings about the money situation clearer when he died. She kept her voice even. I don't have anywhere to go. There. She'd said it plain. 3 days on the trail and 4 months of being methodically stripped of everything. The house, the furniture. The last assumption that there was a floor beneath her. And here she was, in a stranger's barn in Hayes County, with no plan and no money, and the light coming in golden and indifferent through the barn door. Rhett Callahan looked at her for a long moment. He didn't look pitying, which she was grateful for. He looked like a man working through a problem. There's a room in the house, he said. Back bedroom. Nobody uses it. You can have it until you figure out something else. She opened her mouth. It's not charity, he said, before she could object. I need someone to handle the kitchen and the house through the winter. My cook left in September, and I haven't replaced her. You do the cooking and the cleaning, I'll give you room and board and $2 a week. That's a fair arrangement. It was a fair arrangement. It was, if she was being honest, considerably better than the one she'd ridden 3 days to accept. All right, she said. The back bedroom was small but clean, with a window that faced east and a quilt on the bed that someone had made by hand a long time ago. Evelyn set her bag down on the floor and looked at the room and thought, this is what the bottom looks like. She'd come from a family that had never been wealthy, but had always been comfortable. Her father had run a dry goods store in Nacogdoches, and there had always been enough. She'd married Daniel at 22, believing she was marrying a man with prospects, and she'd spent 8 years in San Marcos managing a house and waiting for the prospects to materialize. They hadn't. She'd understood that toward the end, though not the full extent of it. She'd understood that they were stretched thin. She hadn't understood the contracts and the loans and the promises made in her name. She sat down on the edge of the bed and put her face in her hands and allowed herself, for exactly 10 minutes, to feel the weight of all of it. Her husband was dead. She was angry at him, still, constantly, with a ferocity that frightened her sometimes. And she was also grieving him, and those two things existed in her at the same time, and she didn't know how to separate them. He had been, in many ways, a foolish man, a vain man, a man who wanted to believe himself bigger than he was, and had borrowed against futures that never came to make it feel true. She had loved him anyway, which she was starting to think said something about her that she didn't entirely like. 10 minutes. Then she got up, wiped her face, and went to find the kitchen. The kitchen was in better shape than she'd expected. The stove was a good one, a large cast-iron range that someone had kept clean. The pantry was reasonably stocked, if not elegantly. She found flour, cornmeal, dried beans, salt pork, a wheel of hard cheese, some dried peppers. There was a root cellar, she discovered, that still had potatoes and onions from the fall harvest. She made a pot of beans and cornbread, the simplest thing she knew. And when it was done, she set it on the kitchen table and found that Callahan had come in from outside and was washing his hands at the basin. I hope beans is acceptable, she said. I can do something more involved tomorrow, once I know what you have. Beans is fine, he said. They ate in the kitchen, which felt informal and strange. Evelyn had expected a dining room, a degree of formality, some structure that would tell her where she stood. Instead, they sat across the table from each other with the beans and the cornbread between them and the evening settling outside the window. There's a hand named Cutter who sleeps in the bunkhouse, Callahan said. He'll take breakfast at 6. Then there's Tucker, sir. He's older, his knees are bad. He does the books for me when I need them done. He's been taking his meals in the main house. I'll plan for 3 then, Evelyn said. 4. I don't eat small. She looked up and found to her surprise that he was almost smiling. Almost. 4, she said. Understood. They ate without much conversation after that, but it was a silence that didn't feel hostile. Evelyn had lived with silence for a long time. 8 years of Daniel's absences had made her comfortable with it, and this quiet felt more settled than most. The house had a solidity to it. The walls were thick, and the fire in the stove kept the kitchen warm against the November chill outside. She washed the dishes after they ate, and Callahan disappeared somewhere, and she found her way back to the back bedroom and lay in the dark and listened to the unfamiliar sounds of a strange house. She thought about the 4 pieces of paper on the barn floor. She wondered if he'd swept them up or left them there. She thought about the way he'd said, "I'm not forgiving anything," with a flatness that meant something she hadn't fully worked out yet. She thought about Daniel, the way he looked when she'd first met him, at a dance in Nacogdoches, laughing at something she'd said. She thought about the box of letters she'd left behind when she'd sold most of what she owned, not left behind accidentally, but on purpose, because she didn't want to carry them and she couldn't throw them away, so leaving them seemed like the in-between thing. She thought about the quilt she was lying under, which someone had made by hand, and wondered who. She fell asleep before she'd finished the thought. Babang. She was up before dawn. It was habit, partly. She'd always been an early riser, one of the qualities Daniel had found charming early in the marriage, and mildly irritating later. But it was also something else. She needed, in some very direct way, to be useful. She had been made powerless by a series of events she hadn't controlled, and the antidote to that feeling, the only antidote she'd ever found, was work. She built the fire up, put water on for coffee, and started biscuits. She found a side of bacon hanging in the pantry and cut it, started it in the iron skillet. By the time the light was coming gray through the kitchen window, she had biscuits baking, coffee ready, eggs scrambled with a little of the dried pepper. Cutter came in first. He was a compact, weathered man of about 45, with a mustache that had seen better days, and a handshake that was more of a gesture toward the idea of a handshake. "You must be the widow," he said, not unkindly. "Evelyn Hartwell," she said. "Cutter. Just Cutter." He poured himself coffee and sat down and looked at the food on the table with the expression of a man who had expected much less. Rhett said someone was taking over the cooking. Didn't say it'd be an improvement. Who was doing it before? Rhett, mostly. He does all right with beans and meat, not so well with anything that requires patience. Tucker was next, a tall, loose-jointed older man who moved carefully and wore spectacles on a cord around his neck. He nodded at Evelyn with a formality that she found unexpectedly reassuring and took his seat and ate with the focused appreciation of someone who took food seriously. Callahan came in last. He'd been up already. She'd heard him moving through the house before she'd started breakfast, and he came in with the cold of the morning still on his coat and sat down without ceremony. "Biscuits," he said. "Is that a complaint or an observation?" Evelyn said. Cutter hid a smile in his coffee cup. "Observation," Callahan said, and reached for one. It was a small thing, but Evelyn had learned over the years that it was the small things you could trust. The days took on a shape. She cooked breakfast and managed the house through the morning, the endless mechanical work of it, laundry and sweeping and keeping the fires from dying. And in the afternoon, she found that she couldn't stay inside. She started walking the property, at first just to the kitchen garden and back, then farther. The crosshatch was beautiful in a way that crept up on you. The land rolled gently west toward the hills, and there were creekside pecans and cedar brake draws, and along the south fence line, a view that opened up to something vast and quiet. One afternoon, she found herself at the fence, watching a group of cattle in the lower pasture, and Callahan came up beside her. "You're not afraid of them," he said, as a small observation. One of the cattle had come to the fence and was regarding her with wide, placid eyes. "I grew up in East Texas," Evelyn said. "My father kept a few head. Not like this." She gestured at the spread of animals in the pasture. "How many do you run?" "About 400 head, more by spring, if the calving goes well." "You manage that with just Cutter?" "Had 3 hands until September. The other 2 lit out for the north when one of them got a letter from a cousin saying there was work in Colorado territory. He said it without bitterness, as a simple fact. Haven't replaced them yet. That's a lot of work for 2 people. "It is," he agreed. There was a pause. The cattle in the pasture moved together slowly, the way they did when nothing in particular was happening. "I can ride," Evelyn said. He looked at her sideways. "I know you can. I mean, I can do more than cook and clean. If you need help with something that involves being on a horse, I'd rather be useful than walking fences by myself in the afternoon." He looked at her for a moment, not assessing her in the way she was sometimes assessed, calculating her worth, but something more like actually looking, seeing her. "Your mare needs another week off that foot," he said. After that, she agreed. The first letter arrived 3 weeks after she'd settled in. It came through the post office in Wimberley, addressed to Evelyn Hartwell, in a hand she didn't recognize. She sat with it in the kitchen for a few minutes before she opened it. It was from a merchant in San Marcos named Devereaux. He wrote to inform her that her husband had purchased goods on credit over a period of 2 years, that the debt totaled $340, and that as the surviving spouse she was responsible for its settlement. He noted politely but firmly that he expected to hear from her within 30 days. Evelyn set the letter down on the kitchen table and looked at it. $340. She had $11 and some change in the bottom of her bag. She sat with the fact of it. She breathed through the first wave of it, which was pure panic, cold and specific. Then she breathed through the second wave, which was anger, at Daniel, at the open-ended misery of discovering that you hadn't known your own husband, that the man you'd slept beside for 8 years had been running a double life of debt and evasion, and you'd mistaken his silences for privacy instead of lies. Then she folded the letter up and put it in her coat pocket and went to look for Callahan. She found him in the barn, repairing a saddle. He had the kind of stillness that came from work that required attention. Hands moving steadily, eyes down, a focused quiet around him. "I need to tell you something," she said. He kept working. "All right." She told him about the letter. She told him the amount. She told him that she didn't know how many more there might be, that Daniel had a talent for leaving things out. He was quiet for a moment after she finished. Then, "You're not telling me this because you think I'll put you out?" "No," she said. "I'm telling you because you gave me a roof, and you ought to know what might be coming to it." He set the saddle down and looked at her. "Devereaux's a reasonable man," he said. "He'll take installments. We can write him back." "We," Evelyn said. "You're on my property. A creditor showing up here is my business." He said it without drama. "Write him back. Tell him you're aware of the debt, and you'll make arrangements. I'll put up the first payment." "I can't let you do that." "It's a loan," he said simply, "against your wages, if you want to frame it that way. You can pay it back, 6 months, a year, however long it takes." She looked at him. He was already picking up the saddle again, attention returning to the stitching. "Why?" she asked. He didn't look up. "Because that's how things ought to work." She wanted to press him, because that wasn't an answer, not really, or at least not a complete one. But something in the quiet of the barn told her this was what he gave people. Not explanations. Actions. She went back to the house and wrote the letter. December settled over the crosshatch with its particular cold clarity. Evelyn's mare had healed and she'd kept her word. She'd started going out in the mornings with Cutter to help move the cattle between pastures, learning the rhythms of the place. She was not a rancher. She made mistakes. She once drove a section of yearlings the wrong direction down a draw because she'd misjudged the wind and the cattle had done what cattle do, which was whatever they wanted. Cutter had said nothing about it except other way, and she'd corrected and they'd moved on. She liked working outside. It was different from the cooking and cleaning, which she did out of practicality. They needed doing, and she did them, but the outdoor work had something the indoor work didn't. It was harder to think about Daniel when you were counting cattle in a November pasture. The thoughts had less room to move. Callahan had started talking to her more. She'd noticed it gradually. The way the mealtimes had lengthened slightly. The way he'd sometimes stop at the kitchen door in the evenings and ask how things had gone that day. Not small talk exactly. Something more direct than that. He asked about the letter from Devereaux, whether the reply had gone out. He asked once, obliquely, about San Marcos, and she found herself telling him about the house. The little house on Blanco Street that she'd made her own. The garden she'd planted in the second year that had finally come in by the fourth. The way the light hit the back porch in the afternoons. "You miss it," he said. "I miss the version of it I thought it was," she said. She considered that. "The actual house, once I knew what it was standing on, no. I don't miss that." He was quiet for a moment. They were sitting on the porch after supper, the evening cold settling around them. Daniel came to me in the spring of '72, he said. We'd met the year before at a cattle sale in Austin. He was a friendly man, good at conversation. Yes, Evelyn said carefully. He came out here and said he needed $700 to get into a cattle venture. Some deal he'd put together. He wanted to buy a small herd and run it up to Kansas on the drives. He paused. I lent him the money because he needed it, and because he asked, and because I didn't think about it carefully enough. Did the venture happen? He bought a few head, Callahan said. I don't know what happened to them. He sent me a letter in the fall saying the deal had fallen through, promised to pay me back. I didn't hear from him after that. Evelyn turned this over. The drive money. Was that one of the debts he left me? No, that was just mine. I didn't track it anywhere official until he wrote back asking for the contract to be formalized. He paused. Which I also probably should have refused. Why didn't you? He looked out toward the pasture. Because a man asking for something that formal is a man who feels bad about something he can't fix, he said. I figured if having a formal contract made him sleep better, then it was a cheap thing for me to give him. Evelyn sat with that. It was a strange kind of generosity, the kind that accepted being owed rather than pressing the debt. She'd spent a lot of time building a picture of Rhett Callahan in her mind over the past 4 months, and the picture kept proving wrong. He was your friend, she said. It came out more gently than she'd intended. Something like that, Callahan said. He looked at her. I'm sorry he wasn't what you needed him to be. It was such a plain thing to say. Not, I'm sorry he died, or I'm sorry for your loss, or any of the formulas people reached for. Just, I'm sorry he wasn't what you needed. It went straight through whatever she'd been keeping in place. She looked at the pasture for a long moment. The cattle were dark shapes in the distance, barely visible in the failing light. So am I, she said. They sat in silence after that, and the silence was comfortable, and the evening came down around the ranch, and Evelyn thought about how strange it was to be here, of all places. 3 months ago, she had believed she was heading toward captivity, and somehow she had landed instead in something that felt, almost dangerously, like rest. She didn't trust it entirely. She'd learned enough these past 4 months not to trust things entirely. But she sat there on the porch in the dark and let herself have it anyway. Christmas came quietly to the crosshatch. There was no ceremony to it. Callahan was not a ceremonial man. But Cutter produced a bottle of whiskey from somewhere, and Tucker made a pie from the last of the dried apples, and Evelyn roasted the chicken she'd been fattening up since October, and they all sat around the kitchen table and ate too much. At some point in the evening, when the whiskey had gone a third of the way down and Tucker had fallen asleep in his chair, Cutter looked across the table at Evelyn and said, You staying then? What do you mean? She said. I mean, it's been 2 months and you don't look like you're planning to leave. Just asking if that's true. She looked at Callahan, who was looking at his glass. I don't have anywhere else to go, she said. That's still true. That's not a reason for staying, Cutter said pleasantly. No, she agreed. It's not. Outside, the wind had picked up, moving through the cedar draws below the house. The fire in the stove kept the kitchen warm. Tucker snored gently in the corner. She looked at Callahan again. He was still looking at his glass. I like it here, she said, quietly, as if saying it too loudly might break something. He looked up then, and the almost smile was there again, brief, controlled, but present. Good, he said. Outside, the Texas winter settled down hard and quiet over the crosshatch, over the pastures and the cedar breaks and the creek and the 400 head of cattle moving slow and warm in the darkness. And Evelyn Hartwell sat in a stranger's kitchen and felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, something that wasn't quite safe, because she'd learned enough to know that nothing was ever quite safe, but was close enough to matter. She held on to it. January came in hard. The temperature dropped the first week of the new year and stayed down, and the work on the crosshatch shifted the way it always did in deep winter. Less movement, more endurance. The cattle needed hay brought out to the pastures because the grass had gone to frost. The water troughs needed breaking every morning before the animals could drink. Cutter's hands had gotten bad from the cold, an old injury in his right wrist that stiffened in the low temperatures, and Evelyn had taken to wrapping it for him before breakfast without either of them making a particular thing of it. She'd been on the crosshatch for 2 months. She'd stopped counting the days somewhere around week 6, which she'd decided to take as a sign that she'd stopped waiting to leave. That was either progress or a failure of imagination. She hadn't decided which. The gossip had started in town. She'd noticed it first in December, the second time she'd gone into Wimberley with Callahan to get supplies. A woman named Margaret Pruitt had spoken to her warmly enough at the dry goods store, all smiles and questions, and then Evelyn had turned around and caught the look that passed between Mrs. Pruitt and the woman behind her. Quick, expressive, the kind of look that carried a full conversation in half a second. She'd mentioned it to Callahan on the ride back. Not with complaint, just as a statement of fact. People are talking. He'd looked straight ahead at the road. People talk, he'd said, which was true and not particularly useful. By January, it had gotten more specific. Tucker had come back from a trip to the feed store with the kind of careful expression that meant he had information he wasn't sure how to deliver. He'd sat down at the kitchen table with his coffee and turned his cup around in his hands twice before he said, "Heard some things in town today." "About me," Evelyn said. It wasn't a question. "About the situation," Tucker said delicately. "There are folks saying what... I'm just telling you what I heard. There are folks saying it's not a proper arrangement. A widow woman, unmarried man, living under the same roof." Evelyn kept her hands busy with the bread she was making. "What are they suggesting ought to be done about it?" "Well, some of them are saying you ought to be in a boarding house in town, paying your way. The implication being..." Tucker stopped. "The implication being that I'm not paying my way in an appropriate manner," Evelyn said. Tucker had the decency to look pained. "I don't believe that. I want to be clear about that. I know," she said. "Thank you for telling me." She didn't say anything to Callahan that evening. She turned it over in her mind the way you turn over a stone to see what's underneath, not because you expect to like what's there, but because not knowing is worse. She understood the talk. She even understood in a grim and practical way why it existed. A woman alone on a man's property was an arrangement that frontier communities watched closely because the frontier had a way of making people's survival dependent on their reputation, and reputation was a thing people guarded collectively. What bothered her was the particular shape of the insinuation. She had come here with nothing. She was working for her keep. The idea that she was somehow leveraging her position, trading on something other than labor, it sat in her chest like a bruise. She said nothing. She made bread and did the washing and went out in the mornings with Cutter and kept her head up in town. In February, a letter arrived from a woman named Clara Yunt, who identified herself as the wife of a deacon at the Wimberley church. Mrs. Yount wrote to express in careful language that the community would feel much more comfortable with the current arrangement if Mrs. Hartwell were to take up residence in the town boarding house, operated by a respectable widow named Agnes Cole. Mrs. Yount understood that finances might be a difficulty, and she would be willing to help solicit contributions from the ladies' circle to assist with the costs. Evelyn read the letter twice. Then she put it in the stove. She thought about writing back and decided against it. She thought about doing nothing and decided that wasn't right either. She did what she'd started doing with hard things. She went outside. The cedar brakes below the south pasture were quiet in the February morning, the ground hard underfoot, her breath coming in small white clouds. She walked until the house was small behind her, until the only sounds were the creak and the wind in the cedar, and then she sat on a limestone outcrop and looked at the hills to the west and tried to be honest with herself. The letter wasn't entirely wrong, was it? There was something here, something she hadn't named, that she wasn't going to name, that lived in the way a conversation at supper could stretch out for an hour before either of them noticed, that lived in the fact that she knew, now, how he took his coffee and what made him almost smile, and the way his voice got quieter when he was trying to say something important, something that made her angry at Daniel in a complicated way, because she hadn't expected to feel anything like this again, and certainly not this soon. And it felt disloyal, and also felt like none of Daniel's business anymore, which made her angrier. She sat with all of that for a while. Then she went back to the house. Callahan was at the kitchen table when she came in, going through the account book. He had a habit of spreading papers across the kitchen table when Tucker wasn't using the little study off the front room, and Evelyn had given up being annoyed by it. "I need to tell you about the letter," she said. She told him. All of it. The Pruitt woman. What Tucker had heard in the feed store, the letter from Mrs. Yount and its charitable offer. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "What do you want to do?" he said. She sat down across from him. I want to stay, she said. That's the honest answer. I don't want to go to Agnes Cole's boarding house, and I don't want to be managed by a deacon's wife, and I'm not going to take their money. She paused. But I'm also aware that this is your property and your reputation, and if the talk is causing you problems with buyers or neighbors or anyone who matters to the ranch, then that changes things. He looked at her steadily. It hasn't caused me problems. Yet. Evelyn, he said. It was the first time he'd used her first name directly, without it being part of a sentence. Just her name, standing alone. I don't make decisions about my property based on what Margaret Pruitt thinks. That's admirable, she said. It's also easy to say in January when nothing's happened yet. He held her gaze for a long moment. Then he looked back at the account book, which meant the conversation was closing. You stay, he said. That's the decision. She should have left it there. She knew she should have left it there. Why? She said. He looked up. The expression on his face was complicated. Not annoyed, not uncomfortable exactly, but something guarded. The look of a man who had given an answer and found the question still standing. Because you're good for this place, he said finally. Because Cutter's wrist doesn't hurt as much. Because the food is better. Because Tucker has someone to talk to who actually listens. He looked back at the account book. That's enough reasons. It was. She decided to let it be enough. She got up and started on supper. Behind her, she could hear the scratch of his pen, the occasional sound of pages turning. Outside, the February wind moved through the cedar brakes, and the fire in the stove held steady, and Evelyn Hartwell stood in a kitchen that wasn't hers and felt something she didn't have a clean word for, something that sat between gratitude and want, and a grief she hadn't finished with yet. And she stirred the pot and kept her mouth shut and let the evening come. The second letter arrived on a Thursday in early March, and this one was not from a deacon's wife. It was from a company called Ashford & Teller, Debt Collection, out of San Antonio. The letterhead was heavy, cream-colored stock, the kind meant to communicate weight and authority. The writing was precise and formal and entirely without warmth. The letter informed Evelyn that Ashford & Teller had acquired, for collection purposes, several outstanding debts of the late Daniel Hartwell. These included a loan from a private investor in Houston totaling $480, a promissory note to a land speculation company totaling $220, and a merchant credit account in San Antonio totaling $95. The combined total, with accumulated interest, was $807. At the bottom of the letter, a sentence that Evelyn read 3 times. In the event that immediate settlement cannot be arranged, Ashford & Teller is prepared to offer an alternative arrangement, details of which can be discussed in person at a time of Mrs. Hartwell's convenience. She took the letter to Callahan. He read it without expression. When he was finished, he set it down on the table. He didn't speak for a moment. $800, she said. I can read, he said quietly. That's on top of this Devereaux debt, which isn't paid off yet, and whatever other ones might still be out there. She could hear something in her own voice that she didn't like, a thin, high note that was the edge of panic. She pushed it down. Daniel was busy. He was, Callahan said. The alternative arrangement, Evelyn said. That's labor. That's what they do. Debt collection firms. They acquire the debt, and then they offer to settle it against labor contracts. Years of it, in some cases. She talked to enough people in San Marcos to know how it worked. I may have gone from 3 years to 7. Callahan looked at the letter again. Who's handling this for them? It doesn't say. A representative, they said, coming to meet in person. She paused. It says they'll contact me to arrange a time. Through what address? She stopped. Through the post office in Wimberley. That's all they have for me. So they don't know you're here. Not yet. He nodded slowly. He was thinking. She'd learned to recognize that stillness in him, the way he went quiet when he was working something out. Right back, he said. Acknowledge you've received it. Tell them you're aware of the debts and are consulting with counsel. I don't have counsel. Tucker knows enough law to be useful. He'll help you write something that sounds like counsel. He looked at her. Don't panic. That's what they want. I'm not panicking, she said. He gave her a look. I'm adjacent to panicking, she said. That's different. Something moved across his face. Almost a smile. Almost not. Write the letter. Give yourself time. We'll work out what to do. We. He kept saying that. We'll write. Will work out. She kept noticing it and not saying anything about it, because she was afraid that if she acknowledged it, it would stop. She wrote the letter. Tucker helped her, producing from somewhere a reliable grasp of formal correspondence and an ability to phrase things in ways that implied consultation without stating it directly. The letter went out Friday's post. Spring came to the crosshatch the way it always came to that part of Texas. Sudden and insistent, like someone throwing open windows that had been closed all winter. The pecan trees along the creek leafed out in the first warm week of March, and the bluebonnets came in along the fence lines, and the cattle in the south pasture moved differently in the warmer air, less huddled, more spread out. Evelyn had started a kitchen garden. She'd asked Callahan about it in late February. There was a plot behind the house that had been gardened once and gone fallow, and he'd said yes without making a thing of it. She'd spent a week in early March turning the soil and amending it and planning what to put in. It was her garden in the way that nothing on the crosshatch was actually hers, but she'd staked it out and dug it up, and she knew where everything would go, and that was close enough. Cutter had come to look at it one afternoon and stood at the edge of it with his thumbs hooked in his belt. "Tomatoes?" he said. "And beans and squash and some herbs along this edge," she said. "I thought peppers here, where it gets the afternoon light." "Rhett likes peppers," Cutter said, with an absolute absence of anything in his voice. "I know," Evelyn said, also with an absolute absence of anything in her voice. Cutter picked up his hat, turned it over, put it back on. "Nice garden," he said, and walked away. The representative from Ashford and Teller arrived on a Wednesday in late March. His name, he'd written in his reply to Evelyn's letter, was Gareth Lorne. He'd proposed meeting at the dry goods store in Wimberley, which Evelyn had agreed to because it was a public place, and because she had no intention of letting this man come to the crosshatch. She'd asked Callahan to come with her, not as a protector, she was clear about that, but because he knew the region and the people and the legal landscape in ways she didn't, and because she wanted a witness. He came. He drove the wagon in from the ranch and tied it at the post outside Garfield's dry goods and didn't say much on the way in. Gareth Lorne was a trim man of about 50, with the kind of careful grooming that announced he considered himself a professional. He wore a good coat, carried a leather case, and had the practiced warmth of someone who had learned that warmth was a useful tool. He stood up when Evelyn came in, extended his hand, thanked her for her time. "This is Rhett Callahan," Evelyn said. "He ranches in this county." Lorne looked at Callahan with a brief, assessing glance. "I wasn't aware this was a joint meeting." "It isn't," Callahan said. "I'm just here." Lorne's smile thinned slightly, but held. They all sat down on the chairs that Mr. Garfield had arranged at the back of the store with the tact of a man who rented out his space for these kinds of conversations regularly. Lorne opened his leather case and laid out papers with the efficiency of someone who had done this many times. He explained the debts in detail. Amounts, dates, interest rates. He explained that Ashford and Teller had acquired them legally from the original creditors at a discount, and that the full amount was now owed to his company. "And the alternative arrangement," Evelyn said, when he'd finished the recitation. "Yes." He folded his hands. "We found in many cases that direct settlement is simply not possible for surviving spouses. The amounts involved can be quite large. What we offer is a labor contract. You would work in an arrangement we broker, typically in household or domestic service. The wages would be applied against the debt at a rate we'd negotiate. It's quite commonly done." "How long?" Evelyn said. "Given the current total, $807, and at the standard domestic rate, we'd be looking at approximately 7 years. 7 years. She kept her face still. "And if I don't accept the alternative arrangement," she said, "then we'd be obligated to pursue collection through the courts. You'd be summoned, a judgment would be entered, and your assets and wages would be subject to attachment." He spread his hands in a what-can-you-do gesture, which, given your current situation, would be, "What's the legal basis for the labor arrangement?" Callahan said. His voice was mild and specific, the voice of someone asking a question they already know the shape of. Lorne looked at him. "I beg your pardon? The labor arrangement. What statute authorizes a private collection firm to broker a labor contract for a debt that was the debtor's, not the widow's?" "In Texas." A pause. "The contract would be entered into voluntarily." "Would it?" Callahan said. "Mrs. Hartwell would have a choice. She'd have a choice between 7 years of labor she didn't owe in the first place or a court action." Callahan looked at the man with an expression that wasn't hostile but had something hard in it. That's not what most people mean by voluntary. Lorne's professional warmth had cooled slightly. I don't believe I'm being questioned by a rancher on the legal structure of— You're being questioned, Callahan said, by a man who knows this county and the people in it, and who knows that what you're describing has been challenged in Texas courts more than once in the past several years and hasn't always held up. He leaned forward slightly. So I'm asking again, what's the legal basis? Lorne looked at Evelyn. I was hoping to have a direct conversation with Mrs. Hartwell. You are, Evelyn said. He's just also here. There was a long pause. Outside the store's front window, Wimberley went about its Wednesday morning business. A wagon rolling past, 2 women talking at the opposite corner, a dog sleeping in a patch of sun. The merchant debt, Lorne said finally, with a shift in tone that was barely perceptible. The Devereaux account. She was listed on that account. That one is arguably a shared debt. The others, the private loan, the land speculation note, those were in your husband's name alone. So the majority of the $800 is not legally collectible from me, Evelyn said. Lorne was quiet. What is collectible? She said. The merchant account, he said, with the voice of a man recalculating. With interest, approximately $120. Which I'm already making arrangements on through the original creditor, Evelyn said. Mr. Devereaux and I have an agreement. Another silence. Lorne looked at his papers. He looked at Callahan. He looked at Evelyn. I'll need to review the terms of the original debt acquisition, he said finally. It meant he was retreating. He was retreating carefully and professionally, but he was retreating. Of course, Evelyn said pleasantly. I appreciate you coming all this way. They shook hands again. Lorne packed his papers away with slightly less efficiency than he'd unpacked them, and left the store with his leather case and his good coat, and the bell above the door rang when he went out. Mr. Garfield appeared from behind a shelf of dry goods with a canister of coffee. Anyone need this? He said. Evelyn sat back in her chair and realized her hands were shaking slightly, the adrenaline doing what it did when the crisis was over. She pressed them flat on her thighs. How did you know about the court challenges? She said. Callahan was looking at the door Lorne had just gone through. Tucker told me last night he'd read about a case in Austin that went against a collection firm on that exact question. You prepared. You asked me to come, he said, as if this was the obvious consequence of that. She looked at him. He was still watching the door, and she could see the muscle in his jaw, still tight from the conversation, still carrying the residue of having been in a room with a man who was trying to strip something from someone who didn't deserve it. Thank you, she said. He looked at her. The tightness in his jaw eased slightly. Don't thank me, he said. Just means we bought some time. He's not done. His kind doesn't quit after one meeting. He was right. She knew he was right. They got up and paid Garfield for 2 coffees they hadn't drunk, on principle, and went out to the wagon. The drive back to the crosshatch was quiet, the way their silences had gotten. Not empty, but full of things they weren't saying yet. The bluebonnets were coming in along the road, thick in some places, and the sky had the deep particular blue of a Texas March afternoon that looked painted. She thought about 7 years. She thought about what it would look like to simply be afraid for 7 years, to live at the mercy of a firm in San Antonio that had bought her husband's mistakes at a discount and planned to profit from them. She thought about Callahan's voice in that store. That's not what most people mean by voluntary. And the way Lorne had backed down, not because he was a good man, but because he'd met something he hadn't expected and recalculated. She thought about this kitchen garden behind the house, the rows she'd marked out, the places where the tomatoes would go. He'll come back, she said, when they were close enough to the crosshatch to see the limestone walls through the cedar. Probably, Callahan said. And when he does, he'll have done the research. He'll know exactly what he can and can't collect. Probably. So we need to think about what happens then, she said. Callahan drove the wagon through the gate and up toward the barn. He was quiet until he'd pulled the horse up and set the brake. Then he turned and looked at her with an expression she couldn't entirely read. Something careful and forward-looking, like a man checking the weather before he says something. I know, he said. I've been thinking about it. He got down from the wagon and went to the horse's head, and Evelyn sat for a moment longer in the afternoon light and listened to the crosshatch, The cattle in the far pasture, the creak of the barn in the wind, Tucker's voice somewhere carrying a tune badly, and felt the ground shifting under her again. Not the way it had shifted when things fell apart, different, like something settling into place. She got down from the wagon and went to help with the horse, and the afternoon light came golden over the limestone walls, and Wimberley and Gareth Lorne and $800 of other people's decisions receded for now into the back of things. For now. Lorne came back in April. He didn't write first this time. He simply appeared. On a Tuesday morning, riding up the crosshatch road on a bay horse with a second man beside him, and Evelyn saw them from the kitchen window while she was washing the breakfast dishes and felt her stomach drop before she'd fully registered who it was. She dried her hands. She went to the front door and opened it before they'd reached the porch. Lorne looked the same. The good coat, the careful grooming, the professional warmth that didn't reach his eyes. The second man was younger and broader, with the physical confidence of someone hired to stand near things and be noticed. He had a leather satchel across his saddle. "Mrs. Hartwell," Lorne said, "I apologize for arriving without notice. I happened to be in the county on other business." "No, you didn't," Evelyn said. A brief pause. "I've completed my review of the debt acquisitions," he said. "I'd like to discuss the findings." "Come in," she said, because there was no good reason not to, and because she needed to hear what he'd found before she could figure out what to do about it. She put them in the front room, the formal room, the one she rarely used because it had the quality of a room that announced itself as serious. She didn't offer coffee. She sat in the chair across from Lorne and folded her hands in her lap and waited. Callahan came in from the back of the house. She hadn't sent for him. She'd been in the kitchen alone when she'd seen them ride up, and she hadn't had time to find him, and yet here he was, coat on, hat in hand, moving through the front room with the particular ease of a man on his own ground. Lorne looked at him. "Mr. Callahan." "Lorne," Callahan said, and sat down in the chair nearest the door. The second man, the one with the satchel, had positioned himself near the front window. Callahan looked at him once, briefly, and then didn't look at him again, which Evelyn suspected was its own kind of message. Lorne opened his case. He laid out 3 documents, new ones, typed rather than handwritten, with different headings than the previous ones. "After reviewing the original acquisition terms," he said, "I'm prepared to confirm that the private loan and the land speculation note are not, strictly speaking, collectible from you as the surviving spouse under current Texas law." "We know that," Evelyn said. "However," Lorne continued, and the word had weight to it, "the merchant account, the Devereaux credit, was listed jointly, as was a boarding account in San Antonio that your husband maintained." He slid one of the typed documents toward her. "The boarding account was not in the original letter I sent you. It came to our attention during the review. The amount with interest is $63. Evelyn looked at the document. A boarding account. Daniel, in San Antonio, boarding somewhere she'd never heard of, running up a tab she'd never known about. She pushed the thought of what that implied to one side. She could be angry later. And focused on the numbers. "So the legitimate collectible amount is the Devereaux account, which I'm already paying, plus $63 for a boarding house," she said. "That's correct," Lorne said. She waited. There was more. There was always more. "However," he said again, "there is a second matter." He slid the second document across. "During our research into your husband's estate, we identified a promissory note that was signed not by your husband alone, but jointly, by both Daniel Hartwell and Evelyn Hartwell." She looked at it. She looked at her name on the document, the full signature, Evelyn Grace Hartwell, above a date in the spring of 1871. "I didn't sign this," she said. "The signature appears to be yours." "It isn't." She looked at it again. It was close enough that someone who didn't know her hand could be fooled. But the loop on the E was wrong, and she'd never put the period after Mrs. that appeared on this document. "Someone forged it." Lorne's expression didn't change. "That's a significant accusation." "It's also the truth." She pushed the document back across the table toward him. "Who is the creditor on this note?" "A private investor. A Mr. Harlan Webb of Galveston." She'd never heard the name. "How much?" $300. "With interest?" $340. $340 on a forged signature. She looked at Callahan. He was watching Lorne with an expression that had gone very still and very specific. "Where is this Mr. Webb now?" Callahan said. "He's deceased. The note passed to his estate, which engaged our firm for collection. Convenient, Callahan said. I beg your pardon? Convenient that the man who supposedly witnessed a signature is dead, Callahan said. Makes it harder to ask him about the signing. Lorne's professionalism developed a hairline crack in it. Mr. Callahan, I'd ask you to be careful about implying. I'm not implying anything, Callahan said. I'm noting a fact. Evelyn looked at the document again. $340. She thought about what that number meant against what she had. Her $2 a week, what she'd saved, the arrangement with Devereaux that was eating into it. She thought about 7 years, and about Lorne's alternative arrangement, the labor contract. She thought about the second man by the window who still hadn't moved. What are you proposing? She said, flat and direct. Lorne straightened slightly. Given the complexity of the situation, the forged signature claim, the existing payment arrangements, I'm authorized to offer a consolidated settlement, all debts, legitimate and contested, settled against a single labor contract. 4 years, household service, with our firm brokering the placement. He folded his hands. It's quite reasonable given the total exposure. 4 years this time. He'd come down from 7. She looked at him. She looked at the document with the forged signature, at her name written in a hand that wasn't hers on a note she'd never seen, and she felt something in her shift, not break, not collapse, but harden, like something that had been soft getting cold. No, she said. Mrs. Hartwell, no. She said it the same way the second time without raising her voice. I'm not going to sign a 4-year labor contract to settle a debt I didn't owe and a note I didn't sign. That's my answer. Lorne looked at her for a long moment. Then I'll be forced to pursue a legal remedy. Then pursue it. He looked at Callahan. Callahan looked back at him with an expression that contained nothing threatening and nothing yielding, just presence, patient and solid. We'll be in contact, Lorne said. He gathered his documents, put them back in the case. He stood. One more thing, Callahan said. Lorne paused. You rode out here without notice, Callahan said. You brought someone with you who hasn't introduced himself or stated a purpose. He looked at the second man by the window, who had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. I understand why you might think that approach works on a widow woman living alone. I want you to understand that it doesn't work here. He stood up too. He had a few inches on Lorne, and he didn't use them aggressively. Just stood. Next time you have business with Mrs. Hartwell, you write first. Lorne held his gaze for a 3 count. Then he nodded, a minimal, professional nod, and went to the door. The second man followed him without having said a word. Evelyn sat in the front room and listened to their horses leave, the sound fading down the crosshatch road. When the hoofbeats were gone, she became aware that she'd been holding herself very straight and very still, and she let herself unbrace slightly. The signature is forged, she said. I know, Callahan said. Daniel didn't just borrow money he couldn't repay. He signed my name to a debt I didn't know about. I know. She turned the document over in her mind, her name on a note in Galveston, on some dead man's paper, sold to a collection firm for pennies. I don't know if he thought I'd never find out, or if he planned to pay it before it mattered, or if he just... She stopped. Or if he just didn't think about it, Callahan said quietly. That might be the worst one, she said. She stood up and went to the kitchen, because the kitchen was where she thought most clearly, and she needed to think. Callahan followed and sat at the table without being asked, which had become its own kind of habit. Tucker can help with the forgery claim, he said. If it goes to court, a handwriting comparison. That costs money, Evelyn said. And time. And standing in front of a judge and arguing that my dead husband forged my name. She started coffee, hands busy, mind working. Even if I win, I've spent money I don't have and given Lorne's firm a year of pressure to work with. So what do you want to do? She turned and looked at him. There was a question she'd been circling for the better part of 3 weeks, since the wagon ride back from Wimberley, since he'd said I've been thinking about it and left it there. She'd been waiting for him to finish the thought. She was beginning to understand that he wasn't going to finish it unless she pushed. You said you'd been thinking about it, she said, on the way back from meeting Lorne the first time. You said you'd been thinking about what happens when he comes back. I did. What were you thinking? He looked at her for a long moment. The kitchen had the mid-morning quiet of a weekday. Cutter was out with the cattle. Tucker was somewhere with his books. The house was theirs. I was thinking, he said carefully, that there are ways to make you harder to collect from. She waited. A married woman's debts are her husband's, he said. A husband's debts are not, automatically, his wife's. Not in Texas, not since the last revision to the married women's property statutes. He said it precisely, the way Tucker said things when he wanted to be sure they were heard correctly. If you were married, the pre-existing debts from your first marriage would not automatically attach to your new husband's property. Lauren's firm would have a much harder time. The kitchen was very quiet. That's a practical argument, Evelyn said. It is. For a practical solution. Yes. She turned back to the coffee because she needed something to do with her hands. She poured 2 cups and set one in front of him and sat down across the table. Is that the only reason you're raising it? She said. He wrapped his hands around the cup. He didn't answer immediately, and she found herself respecting that. That he didn't reach for a quick answer, that he sat with the question the way it deserved. No, he said. She looked at him. He looked at her. The morning light came in through the kitchen window and lay across the table between them, and the fire in the stove held steady. I'm not asking out of obligation, he said. The words had a careful quality, like he was choosing them from a larger number and discarding the ones that weren't right. I want to be clear about that. I'm not asking because Lauren showed up, or because it's legally useful, or because people in town are talking. He paused. I'm asking because you've been here 5 months, and it would be wrong not to say it plain, so I'm saying it plain. You're saying it in a very roundabout way for someone saying it plain, Evelyn said. Something crossed his face. Not quite a smile, but related to one. I want you to stay, he said. Not because you cook or because Cutter's wrist is better. Because when you're not here, the place is different. Quieter in a way I don't like anymore. He looked at his coffee. I know it's too soon. I know you're still working out your feelings about Daniel. I'm not asking you to have settled everything. I'm asking if there's something here worth considering. Evelyn sat with that. She thought about everything she'd been not naming for 5 months, the thing that lived in stretched-out suppers and the way she knew how he took his coffee. There's something here, she said. He looked up. I don't know what to do with it yet, she said. I'm still angry at Daniel, and I know that anger needs to go somewhere useful before I can trust my own judgment about much else. She was being honest, trying to, the way you tried to be honest when it mattered. But there's something here. He nodded. He didn't push it further, which was also the right thing. Then we have time, he said. They drank their coffee, and outside the bluebonnets were still going, thick along the fence lines, and the morning went on the way mornings did, with work waiting on the other side of it. It was Cutter who told them about the meeting. He came in for lunch that Thursday and sat down with a look on his face that Evelyn had learned to read. Something between annoyed and reluctant, the expression of a man who had news he didn't want to be the carrier of. Heard something in town this morning, he said. Stopped at Haskell's to pick up some wire. And? Callahan said. Lauren's been talking. Cutter poured himself water. To people. To the kind of people that talk to other people. He's been saying, about Evelyn, about the arrangement here. He looked at the table. He's suggesting that a woman living on a man's property who refuses to honor her debts is, the word he used was disreputable. The word sat in the kitchen. He's trying to damage her standing so a judge is less sympathetic, Callahan said. That's my read, Cutter said. And it's working. Mrs. Pruitt's already talking. The Yunt woman wrote another letter. May Haskell mentioned it, said she'd heard. He finally looked at Evelyn. I'm sorry, I didn't want to bring it in. I'm glad you did, Evelyn said. After lunch, she put on her coat and went outside. Not to the cedar breaks this time. She went to the garden, which was coming in now, the first green shoots of the beans she'd put in 2 weeks ago pushing up through the dark soil. She crouched down and looked at them and tried to think clearly. Lauren was smart. She'd underestimated how smart. He couldn't collect legally, or not easily, so he was going to the community instead. Painting her as a woman of bad character, a debtor who refused what she owed, living improperly. If the gossip got bad enough, a local judge might not look kindly on her claims about a forged signature. If the community turned against her, Callahan's reputation turned with it. He was building pressure from outside because he couldn't build it from the law alone. She heard footsteps behind her and didn't turn around because she knew the sound. He's going to keep at it, she said. Yes, Callahan said. He's going to make this place difficult. For you, your neighbors, your buyers. Evelyn. I'm thinking about whether to leave, she said. It came out steady, which surprised her. Not because I want to, because staying is costing you something and I don't want to take from you. You've given me enough. He was quiet for a moment. She could hear him breathing, the wind in the cedar behind the garden. I need you to stop deciding what this place can afford, he said. Not angry. Something lower than angry. Something more direct. That's not your call to make alone. She stood up. She turned around. He was closer than she'd expected. Not crowding her, but close, and looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. The careful guardedness was gone. What was underneath it was plainer and harder to look at. Wanting and worry, and the particular kind of stubbornness that came from a man who had decided something. I asked you a question this morning, he said. You said there was something here, so I'm telling you. It's worth more to me than whatever Lorne does to my reputation with the Pruitt women and the deacons. It's worth more than that. You can't know. I know what I know, he said. I've been by myself on this ranch for 4 years. I know what it felt like before you got here, and I know what it feels like now, and I'm not interested in going back. He held her gaze. I'm not asking you to decide this minute. I'm asking you to stop adding up what you cost me as a reason to go. She looked at him for a long moment. The garden was green and small behind her, just starting. The cedar brakes were moving in the spring wind. All right, she said. All right meaning I'll stop, she said. I won't add it up that way. He breathed out. Something in his shoulders settled. They stood in the garden in the April afternoon, not touching, not saying anything else, but close enough that the distance between them was a thing you noticed. Then Cutter's voice came from somewhere near the barn, hollering something about a loose gate, and the afternoon came back around them, and Callahan turned and went toward the barn, and Evelyn turned back to her garden and crouched down again and looked at the green shoots in the dark soil. She put her hand flat on the earth. It was warm. Things were growing in it. She stayed there for a minute longer, then stood and went back inside to start supper. 2 days later, on a Saturday, Gareth Lorne rode into Wimberley with a purpose. Evelyn wasn't there when it started. She was at the crosshatch, hanging laundry in the April wind, when Tucker came back from town with his jaw set in a way that meant something had happened. She got the story in pieces, Tucker telling it carefully, and Cutter filling in the parts that Tucker was being diplomatic about. Lorne had gone to Haskell's feed store, which in Wimberley functioned as the main gathering point for men on a Saturday morning. He'd told the story of Evelyn's debts, loudly, with the particular framing of a man who wanted his version to be the established one before anyone else's arrived. He'd said that Mrs. Hartwell had refused to honor legitimate obligations. He'd said that she was living off a generous man's charity while evading what she owed. He'd said, and this was the part Cutter told her, watching her face carefully, that a woman who arrived at a stranger's ranch with nothing and had stayed 5 months without a proper arrangement was a woman whose character was open to interpretation. He'd said it in a room with 8 men in it, on a Saturday morning. Callahan had been in the room. Tucker said it carefully. He stood up. Evelyn looked at him. What happened? Tucker glanced at Cutter. He didn't hit him, Cutter said. In case you're wondering. I wasn't... She stopped. What did he do? Cutter pulled his hat off, turned it over. He had the expression of a man who'd witnessed something he was still processing. He stood up and he told every man in that room, and I mean everyone, including Haskell and both the Reiner brothers and Tom Aldridge, who runs the Wimberley Bank, that Mrs. Hartwell was a woman of unimpeachable character who had been defrauded by a collection firm attempting to collect debts that weren't legally hers. He paused. He said it the way you say things when you mean them so much they come out quiet. And Lorne? Lorne tried to argue the point. Rhett let him talk for about 30 seconds, and then he said, Cutter stopped. What? Evelyn said. He said, this woman came to this county to settle a debt that wasn't hers to settle, and I'm telling you what kind of woman does that. You can take that or leave it. Cutter looked at her. And then he told Lorne that if he spread one more word about you in this county, he'd find himself explaining his firm's debt acquisition methods to a judge before the month was out. Tucker's been putting together a case about fraudulent note presentation. The laundry moved in the April wind. A shirt sleeve reached out and back. Evelyn stood in the yard and looked at nothing particular and felt the things she'd been keeping at arm's length for 5 months come up close. Where's he now? She said. Riding in, Tucker said. Left right after. Lorne left too, other direction. She nodded. She went back to the laundry and pinned the last sheet to the line, and then she stood with her hands at her sides and waited. She heard the horse on the road, then the gate, then hoofbeats slowing in the yard. She heard him dismount and hand the horse to Cutter, heard Cutter and Tucker make themselves scarce with the practiced ease of men who understood when they weren't needed. Callahan came around the corner of the house. He stopped when he saw her. He looked tired, not beaten. She'd never seen him look beaten, but tired in the way of someone who had spent something. "Tucker told you," he said. Yes. He looked at the sheet on the line, at the sky, at the ground. He wasn't quite looking at her. "I know that was your business to handle," he said. "I know you didn't ask me to." "Rhett," she said. He stopped. "I know I didn't ask you to," she said. "You did it anyway." He looked at her. I need you to know that means something," she said. "It means something to me." He was very still. "I'm not ready to say yes to everything," she said. "I want to be honest about that. I still have things to work out that are mine to work out, and I don't want to say something important before I can mean it fully." She took a breath. "But I want to stay. Not because I have nowhere else to go. I think I could find somewhere else, if I really needed to. I want to stay because this is where I want to be." He looked at her for a long time. Then he nodded. A real nod. Not just the minimal professional kind. And something in his face settled into something that wasn't relief exactly, but was related to it. "That's enough," he said. Behind them, the sheet moved on the line in the April wind, and the cedar brakes threw their shadows long across the yard, and the afternoon sat around the crosshatch easy and complicated and entirely unresolved, the way real things were. The thing about saying "I want to stay" was that it didn't resolve anything. Evelyn had known that even as she'd said it, that the words were true but incomplete, the way a first step was true but incomplete when you still had a long road in front of you. She'd gone to sleep that Saturday night feeling something she hadn't felt in a long time, something close to solid ground, and woken Sunday morning with all the unfinished business of her own interior sitting on her chest like a stone. She lay in the back bedroom and looked at the ceiling and let herself be honest. She had said there was something here. She had meant it. That wasn't the problem. The problem was that Evelyn Hartwell had believed in something before, had staked 8 years of her life on a man she'd thought she understood, and had been so completely, so catastrophically wrong that she still wasn't sure she trusted her own judgment. The feeling in her chest when Callahan was around, the way his voice steadied her, the way he'd stood up in Haskell's feed store and said what he'd said, all of that was real. She didn't doubt that it was real. What she doubted was herself. Her capacity to see clearly, her ability to know the difference between something genuine and something she wanted badly enough that it looked genuine. Daniel had been charming. Daniel had been warm and funny and full of ideas, and she had looked at all of that and called it character when it was actually just surface. Callahan was not charming. He was quiet and direct, and occasionally almost funny in a way that snuck up on you. And he did what he said he would do, and he'd torn up a legal contract and dropped it on the barn floor the first day she arrived. Those weren't the same things as Daniel's things. She knew that. She needed to keep knowing it. She got up and made breakfast and didn't say anything unusual and went about the Sunday the way she went about all the others. But the stone didn't entirely lift. May arrived with heat that meant business. The spring softness burned off in the first week, and the work shifted again. Longer days, more water needed for the cattle, the kitchen garden demanding attention every morning before the afternoon sun got brutal. Evelyn's tomatoes had come in strong. The beans were producing more than 4 people could eat, and she'd started trading the surplus with Agnes Cole's boarding house in town, which felt like a small satisfaction she hadn't expected. Agnes Cole herself had turned out to be nothing like Evelyn had assumed. She'd met her properly in late April, at the dry goods store, introduced by May Haskell with the slightly anxious air of a woman hoping 2 people would get along. Agnes was a compact, direct woman in her 50s with gray in her hair, and a handshake that meant something. She'd looked at Evelyn straight on and said, "I heard about what happened at Haskell's last month. The whole story, not Pruitt's version." "What's Pruitt's version?" Evelyn had asked. "That you're a scheming widow who's got Rhett Callahan wrapped around your finger," Agnes said pleasantly. "My version is that a collection firm tried to intimidate a woman alone and got more than they bargained for." She tilted her head. "I like my version better." They'd had coffee at Agnes's kitchen table, and Evelyn had come back to the crosshatch with a jar of Agnes's apple preserves and the beginning of something she recognized, carefully, as a friendship. She told Callahan about it at supper. He'd looked at her with the almost smile and said, "Agnes is a good woman. Her husband was a good man." Was? Died about 6 years ago. Fever. He was quiet for a moment. She kept the boarding house going herself, didn't ask anyone for anything. Evelyn thought about that. Like you kept the ranch. He looked at her. I had Cutter. Cutter with a bad wrist and Tucker who can't ride, she said. That's not much. He didn't argue the point, which meant she was right. They ate the rest of supper without talking much, but it was the kind of silence that had something running under it. Later that evening, Cutter was out somewhere and Tucker had gone to bed early, and Evelyn was sitting on the front porch with the last of the day's light going pink over the hills when Callahan came out and sat in the other chair. They'd been doing this more, sitting on the porch after supper when the evening was bearable. Not talking much, just being in the same place. Agnes asked me something today, Evelyn said after a while. What? She asked if I was all right. She paused. She meant, not practically. She meant the other kind. He was quiet. I told her I was working on it, Evelyn said. She said that was an honest answer. It is, Callahan said. She told me something about grief. Evelyn looked at the hills. She said when her husband died, the first thing she felt was sadness, and the second thing she felt was angry that she was sad, because she thought she should have been sadder earlier when she could still do something about it, when he was still there to do something about. She hadn't meant to say that much. It had come out of the ease of the porch, the pink light, the way evenings on the crosshatch had gotten to feel like a place where the inside of things could come out without too much damage. You were sad about Daniel, Callahan said carefully. Not a question. I was sad about the version of Daniel I thought I had, she said. And then I found out about the debts and the loans and the signature on that note, the forged one, and all the sadness got complicated. She paused. I keep being angry at a dead man. It's an exhausting way to live. Yes, he said. It is. She looked at him. There was something in those two words, a weight to them, personal, that she'd caught glimpses of before and never pressed. Was there someone? She said. Before, for you. He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then, her name was Clara. We were going to be married about 7 years ago. He looked at his hands. She went back to her family in Georgia. Her father didn't think a Texas rancher was what she needed. Did she think that? I think she thought what her father thought, he said, which is its own answer. Evelyn looked at the hills again. 7 years of a quiet ranch and a man who'd closed something off in himself and kept working. She understood that. The way you built walls out of work, kept moving because moving was the alternative to sitting still with loss. She's the reason the back bedroom had a quilt, she said. Not a question. A pause. Her mother made it. She left it when she left. He said it flatly, without drama. I kept it because it was a good quilt. Evelyn almost smiled. It is a good quilt. They sat on the porch until the last light was gone and the stars came out hard and bright the way they did over open Texas. And then they went inside and went to their separate rooms, and nothing had been decided, but the stones were a little lighter than they'd been. The letter from Tucker about the forged note came in the second week of May. He'd been working on it since April, writing to contacts in Austin, researching the Webb estate, tracing the chain of acquisition from the original supposed creditor to Ashford and Teller. He'd done it in his methodical, quiet way, the way Tucker did everything, without announcing his progress until he had something worth announcing. He laid the papers out on the kitchen table on a Tuesday evening with the air of a man presenting something he was proud of. The Webb estate, he said, does not appear to have had any legitimate notes receivable from Daniel Hartwell at the time of Harlan Webb's death. I found a probate inventory from the Galveston County records. Webb's estate was listed in 1872, and there's no mention of any note from a D. Hartwell or any Texas debtor of that description. He tapped the paper. What Ashford and Teller acquired from that estate was almost certainly manufactured after the fact. Manufactured by who? Callahan said. That's harder to prove, Tucker said. But the handwriting on the note, I had it looked at by a woman in Austin who does document work for the courts. Her opinion, in writing, is that the note and signature are not consistent with documents known to be genuine from either party. He slid a second paper across. She'll testify to it if it comes to a hearing. Evelyn looked at the papers. The forgery that had been hanging over her for 2 months, given a name, given proof. What does this do to Lorne's case? She said. It makes it essentially worthless, Tucker said. If we file a complaint with the court in Austin about fraudulent debt presentation, Ashford and Teller will have a much larger problem than one contested note. Collection firms operate on reputation. If they're known for presenting fraudulent documents, they lose the ability to operate. He folded his hands. My opinion is that when we send them this analysis, they'll withdraw the contested note and close the file. And the Devereaux account? Evelyn said. That's legitimate and ongoing, but you're current on the arrangement and Devereaux's a reasonable man. That's manageable. Tucker looked at her. The boarding account, the San Antonio one. I'd recommend paying it off in a lump if you can. $63. It closes that piece entirely. $63. She had 51 saved. She looked at the table. I can cover the difference, Callahan said. I'll pay you back, Evelyn said immediately. I know you will. Tucker gathered his papers with the satisfied expression of a man who'd done the thing he was good at and had it matter. He said goodnight and went to bed, and Evelyn and Callahan sat across the table from each other in the kitchen with the lamp between them. It's almost done, she said. The feeling attached to that was strange. Not quite relief, not quite the release she'd expected. Closer to, now what? Almost, Callahan said. Tucker should send the letter to Ashford and tell her this week. He will. She turned her coffee cup. She was thinking about what had been underneath the debt problem all along, so the thing the debt had been holding at a distance, or maybe the thing she'd been using the debt to hold at a distance. As long as she was managing a crisis, she didn't have to manage the other thing. I've been thinking about what you said, she said. In the kitchen, in March. He was still. About staying. About what you asked. She looked at her hands. I want you to know I've been thinking about it seriously. Not as a practical solution to a legal problem. I heard what you said, that wasn't what it was. I believed you. It wasn't, he said. I know. She looked up. But I'm scared, Rhett. She'd used his name directly rarely. It still felt specific, a little weighted. I was wrong about a person before, a person I thought I knew. And the cost of that was, you saw what the cost was. I rode in here on a lame horse with $11 and no plan. I don't want to make another decision from a place of, she searched for the right word, wanting something badly enough that I stopped seeing clearly. He listened. He didn't rush to reassure her, didn't wave it off, didn't tell her she was wrong to feel what she felt. He just listened, which was the thing she needed most and would have gotten least from Daniel. That's fair, he said. I'm not saying no, she said. I want to be clear about that. I know. I'm saying I need... She tried to find it. I need to know the difference between what's real and what's just relief, gratitude, needing somewhere to land. She looked at him. You've been good to me. Better than I expected. Better than I probably deserved when I rode up here with a legal contract in 5 months of someone else's disaster. And I don't want to confuse being grateful for what you've done with the other thing. He was quiet for a long moment. The lamp threw its small circle of light across the table. How would you know the difference? He said. Not challenging, genuinely asking. The question of a man trying to understand rather than win. She thought about it. I think I'd know if I tried to picture leaving, she said slowly. If I tried to picture loading that bag and riding out, and if what I felt was mostly relief, then it's gratitude. If what I felt was... She stopped. She looked at the kitchen, at the stove she'd learned, the window she'd looked out of every morning for 5 months, the table with the account book spread across it. She thought about the porch and the pink light over the hills, and the cedar breaks, and the garden with the tomatoes coming in. She thought about sitting across from this man, and how it felt different from every other sitting she'd done. It's not relief, she said quietly. When I think about leaving... He looked at her, not the almost smile this time, something more open than that. Then that's something to go on, he said. She nodded. They sat there in the lamplight, the unfinished business between them hanging in the air not unpleasantly, like weather that hadn't arrived yet but was coming and was going to be worth it. I need a little more time, she said. Not a lot, just take it, he said. She looked at him. You're very patient. I have 400 cattle, he said. I've been training myself to be patient for years. That surprised a real laugh out of her, and not a polite one, a genuine one, sudden and a little rusty from disuse. He looked startled by it, and then something in his face went warm in a way she hadn't seen before. She covered her mouth and got the laugh under control. "That may be the least romantic thing anyone has ever said to me," she said. "I wasn't trying to be romantic," he said. I was trying to be accurate." "Well," she said, "you succeeded." She got up and took both cups to the basin, and she could feel him watching her back, and it didn't make her uncomfortable. It made her feel present. In the room, in her own body, in a specific moment that was separate from the grief and the debt and the long slide of the past year. Present. That was the word. She turned around. "Good night, Rhett." "Good night," he said. She went to the back bedroom and lay in the dark under the quilt that Claire's mother had made, and she thought about the word present and what it meant that she could feel it here, in this borrowed room, in this life she hadn't planned. Tucker sent the letter to Ashford and Teller the following Thursday. Evelyn didn't read it before it went. Tucker said he'd handle the language and she trusted him. But he told her afterward that it was thorough and specific and contained the document analyst's findings in full, with a clear statement that they were prepared to file a formal complaint with the Austin court if the fraudulent note was not withdrawn within 30 days. 11 days later, a short letter came back from Ashford and Teller stating that upon further review, the note attributed to the Webb estate had been found to contain irregularities and was being withdrawn from the collection file. No apology. No admission. Just the quiet closing of a door they'd opened in bad faith. Evelyn read the letter in the kitchen and set it down on the table and stood with her hands flat on the wood and breathed. Tucker had said "I told you so" was beneath him, and then said it anyway, and she'd let him. Cutter had opened the whiskey, which he seemed to keep in inexhaustible supply. Callahan had said nothing. He'd read the letter, set it down, and squeezed her shoulder once, brief and specific, his hand there and then not there, and gone back outside. She'd stood in the kitchen holding on to the feeling of that hand on her shoulder long after he was gone. June came in green and wide. The calving that spring had gone well, better than Callahan had projected, and the ranch had the busy, forward-moving feel of a place building toward something. Evelyn had started helping with the account books, at Tucker's request, because Tucker's eyesight was getting worse and the detail work tired him. She'd discovered she was good with numbers, better than she'd known, having never had occasion to use the skill for anything beyond household accounts. She and Tucker worked at the kitchen table in the evenings, the books spread between them, and she'd started to understand the ranch not just as a place she worked, but as an enterprise with a shape to it. One evening in late June, she was going through the ledger when she found the entry from 2 years ago. Dated in the spring of 1872. Loan, D. Hartwell, $700. She sat with it. Below it, in different ink, added later, a single word, forgiven. She looked at that word for a long time. Callahan had written it in before he'd ever met her, before she'd ridden up to his gate with her lame horse and her legal contract and her $11. He'd already decided to forgive it. She closed the ledger. She sat in the kitchen with the evening light coming in through the window, and she felt something move in her chest that she recognized now. Not the grief, not the anger, not the gratitude. The other thing. The one she'd been checking against itself for months, testing its weight to see if it was real. It was real. She knew it the way she'd said she would know it. Not because it was convenient, not because she was out of options, not because she was grateful or afraid or needed somewhere to land. She knew it because it had been growing slowly, steadily, in the same way the beans in the garden grew, without drama, without announcement, just getting taller every morning until one day you looked and they were there. She found him in the barn at dusk, checking the horses for the night. The barn had the familiar smell of it, hay and leather, and the particular warmth of large animals. She stood in the door. He turned when he heard her. She said, "I know the difference now." He went still. "I've been thinking about leaving the way I said I would. I've been trying to picture it clearly, and what I feel is not relief. Not close to relief." She looked at him across the length of the barn. "I feel like I'd be leaving something I want." He put down what he was holding. He walked toward her with the unhurried ease of a man on his own ground and stopped a few feet from her. "That was what you needed to know?" he said. "Yes." He looked at her. "And now you know it." "Yes. So what do you want to do with it?" She had thought about how this conversation would go, And now that it was happening, she found that she didn't want to manage it. She was tired of managing things. "I want to say yes," she said, "to what you asked, if it's still on offer." He looked at her for a moment, just looked at her, not hurried, not performing anything. Then he said, "It's still on offer." She breathed out. She hadn't realized she'd been holding her breath. "I'm not going to be easy," she said, because she needed to be honest and because she was constitutionally incapable of letting important moments be completely clean. "I'm still working on the Daniel situation, the anger. I don't sleep well sometimes. I have opinions about the account books that Tucker says are unnecessary." "Tucker says a lot of things," Callahan said. "I'm serious." "I know you are." Something in his face had gone warm again, the way it had in the kitchen the night she'd laughed. "You think I've been living with you for 6 months and I don't know who you are?" She looked at him. "And?" "And I asked you anyway," he said. It was quiet in the barn. Outside, the last light was going off the hills. One of the horses shifted, settled. Evelyn Hartwell stood in the door of the barn and looked at Rhett Callahan and felt, in spite of everything that had led here, in spite of Daniel and the debts and the forged signature and Gareth Lorne and 7 months of being terrified and angry and slowly, stubbornly putting herself back together, felt something that was not complicated, just clear. "All right," she said, and she meant it all the way down. He crossed the last few feet between them, and she didn't move away. And he put one hand against her face the way you touch something you were careful about. And they stood there in the barn door with the evening settling around the crosshatch and the cattle moving somewhere in the dark pasture below, and the cedar brakes going black against the last of the sky. It wasn't smooth. His thumb caught in her hair. She put her hand against his chest and felt his heart going hard under her palm, which meant he was not as calm as he looked, which made her feel better about the fact that she was not calm at all. "We should tell Tucker," she said, against his shoulder. "Tucker already knows," Callahan said. She pulled back slightly. "How does Tucker already know?" "Because Tucker knows everything that happens in this house approximately 48 hours before it happens," Callahan said. "It's how he is." She thought about Tucker at the kitchen table with his books and his careful expression and his habit of being elsewhere when he wasn't needed. "He's going to be insufferable about it." "Probably." "Cutter's going to open the whiskey again." "Definitely." She laughed, and he laughed too. A real laugh, low and surprised, as if he hadn't expected it to come out. And they stood in the barn door in the dark and laughed together at nothing in particular, which was its own kind of answer to everything. Tucker was, as predicted, insufferable about it. He found out the next morning, not because anyone told him, but because he came to breakfast and looked at the two of them across the kitchen table and said, with the satisfied precision of a man whose calculations had proven correct, "Well, it's about time." Then he poured his coffee and opened his ledger and said nothing else about it, which was somehow worse than if he'd made a speech. Cutter opened the whiskey before noon. He said it was for a sore throat. Nobody argued the point. The weeks that followed had a quality Evelyn hadn't expected. Not the clean, uncomplicated happiness of stories she'd grown up hearing, where things resolved and then stayed resolved, but something messier and more actual. There were good mornings, and there were mornings when she woke up at 3 in the dark with her chest tight and her mind running over Daniel's ledger of failures, all the ways she'd missed what was right in front of her face, and she'd lie there working through it until the feeling passed. It always passed. But it always came back too. And she'd stopped pretending it wouldn't. Callahan knew. She hadn't told him in detail, but he had the particular attentiveness of someone who watched people closely without making a performance of it, and sometimes she'd come to breakfast after a bad night and find that he'd already made the coffee and left it hot on the stove and gone outside without requiring anything from her. No questions, no worried hovering, just the coffee and the space to be whatever she was that morning. It was, she thought, the most practical form of tenderness she'd ever encountered. She told Agnes about the engagement on a Wednesday in early July, over coffee at Agnes's kitchen table. She wasn't sure what she'd expected. Excitement, maybe, or the particular kind of knowing warmth that older women sometimes produced when younger women told them things. Agnes looked at her for a moment and then said, "Are you scared?" "Yes," Evelyn said. "Good," Agnes said. "That means you understand what it costs." Evelyn looked at her. "That's not particularly reassuring." It wasn't meant to be reassuring, it was meant to be true. Agnes refilled both cups. "I was terrified when I married Gerald. I thought, What if I'm wrong about him? What if I don't know him as well as I think? What if I'm making a decision that's really just fear wearing the costume of love? She set the pot down. You know what I found out? What? That the fear doesn't go away when you decide. It just changes shape. She looked at Evelyn. The question isn't whether you're scared. The question is whether what you're walking toward is worth being scared for. Evelyn sat with that. Outside Agnes's window, Wimberley was going about its July business. A horse tied at the post across the street, two men talking outside the bank, a kid running for reasons known only to himself. It's worth it, she said. Then stop waiting to feel sure, Agnes said. Nobody feels sure. They just go. She rode back to the crosshatch in the afternoon heat with Agnes's words sitting in her, and she thought about all the ways she'd been waiting for certainty, as if certainty were a thing that arrived. A letter you opened, and it told you what to do. She'd been waiting for the grief to finish before she moved forward. She'd been waiting to stop being angry at Daniel. She'd been waiting to feel healed before she allowed herself to act like someone who was healing. The frontier that had brought her here, all that open Texas land between San Marcos and Hays County, 3 days on a lame horse with a legal contract and $11, had never offered her certainty. It had offered her a gate. She'd ridden through it. She could do that again. The wedding was set for the first Saturday in August. It was not going to be elaborate, which suited both of them. Callahan had said, when they discussed it, that he didn't need an audience, just a witness. And she'd said she agreed, and then Agnes had gotten involved. And the guest list had quietly expanded to include the Haskells and Tom Aldridge from the bank, and 2 neighboring ranching families whose names Evelyn was still learning. It was still small by most measures. By the measures of her first wedding, the one in Nacogdoches with 40 people in a dress her mother had helped her make, and Daniel looking fine in a borrowed coat, it was very small. She wasn't sorry about that. The first wedding had been a performance of a future. This one was going to be just the thing itself. There was one piece of unfinished business. She'd been carrying it since June, since the night in the barn, and she kept finding reasons not to deal with it, and then recognizing the reasons as excuses and still not dealing with it. It was the letter she needed to write to her sister in Missouri. Martha. The circumstances she'd told Callahan about back in November, the ones that made Missouri not an option, were that she and Martha had not spoken in 3 years. The falling out had been about Daniel, about Evelyn's refusal to hear Martha's concerns before the marriage, and her greater refusal to hear them after, and about a letter Martha had sent in year 4 that had said, with the particular cruelty of someone who was right and knew it, that Evelyn had made her bed and would now have to lie in it. Evelyn had not written back. She had not written back for 3 years. She sat down with paper and pen on a Tuesday evening in late July, with the lamp burning low and the house quiet around her, and she wrote the letter. She didn't explain everything: the debts, Lorne, the forged signature, the 7 months on the crosshatch. Some of it she did explain because Martha deserved to know, but she kept it short because the point of the letter was not the story. The point was the end of it. I'm getting married again, she wrote. His name is Rhett Callahan, and he is a rancher in Hays County, and he is a good man. I know you'll want to say something about my judgment, and I want to tell you that I've thought about that carefully, and I'm going anyway. I'm not writing to ask your permission or your opinion. I'm writing because you're my sister, and I've been stubborn and stupid about that for 3 years, and I don't want to start a new life still carrying the stupid thing. You don't have to write back, but I'd like it if you did. She sealed the letter and addressed it and left it on the table for the morning post and went to bed and slept without waking, which felt like its own kind of answer. The Saturday morning of the wedding came in clear and dry and hot, the way Texas in August announced itself without apology. Evelyn stood in the back bedroom and looked at herself in the small mirror and assessed the situation with the honesty she'd been practicing. She was 30 years old. She had lines at the corners of her eyes from squinting in the Texas sun, and her hands had gotten harder since November from the work, and her hair was doing something complicated that Agnes's attempts to fix it had only partially resolved. She was wearing a dress she'd made herself from fabric she'd bought in Wimberley. Blue. A deep practical blue that she could wear after, which seemed important. Not white. She was done with performing things. Agnes knocked on the door and came in and looked at her and said, "You look like yourself." "Is that a compliment?" Evelyn said. "It's the best one I know how to give," Agnes said. They went out to the front room where Tucker was standing in his best coat looking like a man trying not to cry and failing in advance, and Cutter was in a clean shirt that appeared to have been ironed, which was an event of some significance. The Haskells were in the yard, the Aldridges, the neighboring families, the Reeners, and the Beaumonts. About 20 people in total gathered in the yard of the Crosshatch on a Saturday in August, because two people who had both been alone for too long had found each other by way of a debt, a torn contract, and 7 months of winter and spring and summer work. Callahan was standing near the fence at the edge of the yard, talking to Old Man Reiner, and he looked up when she came out of the house. And he stopped talking. She walked toward him across the yard. The grass was dry, and the light was hard and bright, and there was nothing soft about the scene. No flowers she'd planted lining the path, no music, just the ordinary yard of a working ranch with the barn behind it, and the cattle visible in the far pasture, and the heat already building even this early in the morning. He looked at her the way he'd looked at her in the barn in June, steady and open, and like someone who had made up his mind about something and was at peace with the making. "You look fine," he said when she got to him. "You're very free with compliments," she said. "I said you look fine. That's a high bar for me, and you know it." She did know it. She smiled. They stood in front of the Justice of the Peace, a compact, serious man named Briggs, who did this on weekends and seemed to understand that people didn't want it drawn out. And they said the words. The traditional ones, the simple ones, the ones that had been said 1,000 times in 1,000 yards, and still managed to mean something specific when it was your turn to say them, to have and to hold, to love and to cherish. She said them and meant them and felt the fear Agnes had talked about, present, real, the understanding of what it cost, and said them anyway. She went. When it was done and Briggs had made it official, Cutter opened the whiskey, which he had apparently been holding in readiness, and Tucker produced from somewhere a cake that Agnes had clearly made and that Tucker was taking credit for, and the 20 people in the yard of the Crosshatch ate and drank in the August heat and said the things people said at these events, and Evelyn stood in the middle of it and felt, not floating, not transported, not transformed in any cinematic way, just here, present, in a specific yard on a specific day, married to a specific man, alive. It was enough. It was more than enough. Later, when most of the guests had gone and Tucker and Cutter had taken themselves to the bunkhouse with the remains of the whiskey, Agnes hugged her at the gate and said quietly, "He looked at you the whole time, even when Reiner was talking to him." "I know," Evelyn said. Agnes pulled back and looked at her with the frank assessment of a woman who had been through things and come out the other side. "You're going to be all right." "I know that too," Evelyn said. And she did. Autumn came to the Crosshatch, and the work changed shape again the way it always did, the harvest of what the year had put in. The kitchen garden had produced more than Evelyn had planned for. The tomatoes had gone enormous. The beans had been excessive. The peppers had come in so heavy she'd spent 3 weekends putting them up in jars. Agnes had taken some. The boarding house kitchen had taken more. There was still a shelf of jars in the pantry that would get them through the winter. She was still doing the account books with Tucker, who had officially conceded that her way of organizing the feed costs was more legible than his, which he'd framed as a commentary on her handwriting rather than her method, but which she'd accepted as the concession it was. The Devereaux account, Daniel's merchant debt, was paid off in October, the last installment. She'd made the final payment herself, in person, at Devereaux's store in San Marcos, because she'd wanted to close that door with her own hands. Devereaux had been a stout, decent-looking man who'd shaken her hand and said he was sorry for the circumstances and meant it. She'd thanked him and meant that too, and ridden back to Hays County with the particular lightness of someone who had finished a long thing. On the way back, she'd stopped at the cemetery on the edge of San Marcos where Daniel was buried. She hadn't planned to. She'd just found herself turning off the road. She stood at the stone for a while. It was plain. She hadn't had money for anything elaborate when he died, and what little there'd been had been eaten up by the most urgent creditors before she'd thought about markers. His name, his dates, nothing else. She stood there and let herself feel the whole of it. The marriage, the years, the version of him she'd loved and the version she'd slowly discovered, and the way those two things lived in her simultaneously and probably always would. She was angry at him still. She thought she might always be angry at him, in some small, persistent way. The way you stayed annoyed at someone who'd inconvenienced you greatly and was no longer around to apologize for it. But she was also something else. She was someone who had come out the other side of what he'd left her with. And what she'd found on the other side was not what she would have planned, not what she would have chosen, but hers. Fully, actually hers. "I found a good one," she said out loud, to the stone and the November air and nobody in particular. "I thought you should know." She wrote home. The letter from Martha arrived in November. It had been 4 months since Evelyn had sent hers, and she'd started to think it wasn't coming, that her sister had read the words, "I've been stubborn and stupid," and decided that was true but not sufficient. She'd made her peace with that, or most of it, but it came. On a Tuesday, with the first real cold of the season moving in from the north, a letter in Martha's handwriting that Evelyn recognized immediately. The precise, slightly cramped letters of a woman who'd been taught to write by someone who valued neatness above all else. She took it to the porch and opened it. Martha wrote the way she talked. Direct, a little dry. Not much room for sentiment except where sentiment forced its way in. She said she'd been waiting for 3 years for Evelyn to write, and had decided at some point that she would not be the one to go first, which Martha acknowledged was also stubborn. She said she was glad about the marriage, though she reserved the right to form her own opinion about Rhett Callahan until she'd met him, which might take some time given the distance. She said that the situation with Daniel's debts sounded like a disaster that Evelyn had handled with more competence than Martha might have managed, which was as close to a compliment as Martha generally got. At the end, she wrote, "I've missed you. I didn't say it for 3 years because I was angry, but it was true the whole time." Evelyn read that last line twice. Then she folded the letter and held it in her lap and looked at the hills to the west, going brown with November, and felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't realized was still tight. Callahan came out and sat in the other chair. He looked at her, and she looked at him, and she held up the letter without saying anything. "Martha," he said. He knew the outline of the story. "Martha," she said. He nodded. He didn't make it into more than it was. He just sat with her in the November cold while she finished the feeling. And that was the right thing, and he knew it was the right thing. And this, she thought, sitting there, this was what she'd been checking against itself all those months. This specific, unheroic, uncomplicated rightness. She wrote back to Martha that evening. She described the ranch, the limestone house, the 400 cattle, the kitchen garden that was now put to bed for winter. She described Callahan in the way you describe someone you'd watched closely for a year. Not his looks, not a list of qualities, but specific things. The way he went still when he was thinking. The almost smile. The fact that he'd forgiven Daniel's debt before she ever arrived and written "forgiven" in the ledger and said nothing about it. "He is not a simple man," she wrote, "but he is a clear one. You know where you stand. After everything, I've decided that's what I needed." Winter came in earnest in December. The crosshatch hunkered under it the way the limestone house had always hunkered. Thick walls holding the warmth, the cattle in the sheltered pastures, the work going on because work on a ranch went on regardless of the season. They'd taken on 2 new hands in October. Brothers named Voss, young and capable and slightly in awe of Cutter in a way that Cutter managed not to find flattering, mostly unsuccessfully. The bunkhouse was fuller than it had been in years. The kitchen in the mornings had acquired the particular organized chaos of feeding 6 people at different times, and Evelyn had solved it by making a larger pot of everything and setting it where people could serve themselves, which Tucker had initially objected to on grounds of propriety, and had then quietly stopped objecting to when he noticed it worked. On a cold evening in late December, Evelyn was at the kitchen table with the account books when she found herself writing the final entry for the year. The numbers told the story plainly, the way numbers did. The calving returns, the feed costs, the wages, the sale price per head at the fall market. Tucker had told her it was the best the ranch had done in 3 years, and she'd looked at the numbers and seen that it was. Not because of anything she'd done particularly. The cattle were Callahan's cattle. The land was his land. The years of work were his years. But she was part of it now. Her name was in the account. Her handwriting was in the ledger. She put the pen down and looked at the kitchen, the fire in the stove, the jars of peppers on the shelf, the coat Callahan had left on the hook by the back door, which was too close to her coat, which was also on the hook, and she kept meaning to say something about the hooks, but never did because it didn't actually bother her. She thought about the woman who had ridden up to this gate 13 months ago, 30 years old, broke, newly widowed, holding a legal contract that was supposed to define the next 3 years of her life. She had been so certain that the crosshatch was a prison she was riding toward. She had prepared herself for captivity. What she'd found instead was not a rescue. She was clear-eyed enough to resist that framing, because nobody had rescued her. She had paid the debts she could pay. She had fought the ones she didn't owe. She had done the work, made the food, planted the garden, argued with Tucker about the ledger, ridden the south pasture with Cutter through sleet in February because the cattle needed moving, and she'd said she could ride and she was going to mean it. She'd built this as much as it was built. Alongside Callahan, alongside Cutter and Tucker, alongside the slow work of her own interior that never finished, probably, but got somewhere day by day. That was what nobody told you about the hard years. Not that they ended, though sometimes they did, but that you changed inside them. That you found out what you were made of, not because you wanted to, but because the circumstances stopped giving you the option of not finding out. That the woman who came out the other side was not the same woman who went in, and that this was not a tragedy but a fact, and what you did with the fact was the story. Evelyn Hartwell, Evelyn Callahan. Now, though she still caught herself with the old name sometimes, had arrived at a stranger's ranch believing she deserved years of suffering. She had been wrong about a lot of things in her life, but she'd been most wrong about that. Callahan came in from outside, bringing the cold with him, and stopped when he saw her looking at the kitchen with that particular expression. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said. "Just thinking." He came to the table and looked at the ledger. "Done?" "Done." He sat down across from her. The lamplight was between them, the same as it always was. "Tucker says it's a good year," she said. "Tucker's right," he said, which was not something he said easily, and she noted it. "Next year will be better," she said. She'd been looking at the feed costs. There was a supplier in Austin who was cheaper than the one they were using, and she'd been meaning to raise it with him. "I found something in the accounts that I want to talk to you about." He looked at the ledger, then at her. "Now?" "It can wait until morning." He looked at her with something that had gotten easier between them over the year. The warmth that used to be careful, that had learned it didn't have to be careful anymore. "Then it can wait," he said. Outside the window, the December darkness had settled over the crosshatch. The cattle were in from the cold. The cedar brakes were still. The limestone house held its warmth against the season the way it had held it for years, built for exactly this. For people inside it, for a fire burning, for the long, patient work of making a life in a hard place. There were things still unfinished. There would always be things unfinished. Martha hadn't visited yet, and the Devereaux account was closed, but the memory of the debt wasn't, and Evelyn still woke sometimes at 3 a.m. with her chest tight and her mind running its old tracks. The anger at Daniel came and went like weather. Less frequent now, quieter, but still present. She'd stopped fighting that. You didn't fight weather, you dressed for it. But here's what she understood now, sitting at the kitchen table of the crosshatch, with the account books closed, and the lamplight steady, and the man across from her who had torn up a contract the day she arrived, and never once asked her to be grateful for it. Freedom was not a destination. It was not the moment the debts were paid, or the collection firm withdrew, or the letter came back from your estranged sister, or the judge's name stopped making you flinch. Freedom was a practice. It was the daily decision to stay in the room with your own life, the hard parts and the good parts both, without running from one and grasping too hard at the other. She had come to this county in chains she thought were legal. She had discovered they were only paper, but paper could still bind you if you let it. The real chains were the ones inside, the ones made of other people's failures that you wore as your own, the ones made of grief you'd decided was permanent, the ones made of the story that you'd told yourself too many times until it felt true. "I should have known. I should have seen. I am the kind of woman who gets this wrong." She had been wrong about some things. She would be wrong about things again. That was not the end of the story. That was the condition of being in one. Callahan reached across the table and turned the lamp down slightly, the way he did when they were going to stay a while longer. No reason except that the lower light was easier. She looked at him and he looked at her, and the crosshatch held them in the quiet of December with everything it had built up around them over a year. The work and the arguments about ledgers, and the bad nights, and the good ones, the garden and the cattle, and the whiskey Cutter opened too often, and the cake Tucker pretended to make, Agnes's voice saying nobody feels sure, they just go, the 4 pieces of a torn contract on a barn floor that had started all of it. All of it hers now. Not because it had always been, but because she'd stayed, because she'd worked and fought and planted things, and opened the account book and written the letters, and stood in the barn in the June dusk and said, "I want to say yes." Outside, the Texas winter settled down long and wide and patient over the hills. Inside, the lamp burned low, and Evelyn Callahan stayed at the table with her husband and let the year close around her like a door she'd walked through by choice, eyes open, and didn't look back.